Is everyone ready?
Yes, I am.
All right. Greetings, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the third webinar under our project, Promoting Women in Leadership, Diversity on Boards in Australia and India. Our project uses a multi-pronged and multi-stakeholder approach to understand factors that affect representation of women on boards. This aim is sought to be achieved through interactive and research tools for greater effectiveness and reach. Instead of a study confined to academic journals, which very few people might read, we thought to combine our research with interactive webinars to generate awareness on the importance of enhancing diversity on boards with a focus on gender. On the research side, we are presently conducting a qualitative and quantitative comparative study for identifying strategies and proposing best practices to improve gender representation on boards. There are two sectors that drew our attention: sports and infrastructure. This is for two reasons. First, gender representation overall within these sectors, leaving the national sports federations aside, is lower than other sectors such as healthcare. Second, both countries have bonded over sports in the past. Who doesn't love a game of cricket or football or hockey? Furthermore, the India Economic Strategy 2035 that outlines Australia's economic plan for strengthening partnership with India identifies both sports and infrastructure as critical areas for the two nations to work together. Reciprocally, India's economic plan under the Australia Economic Strategy also considers sports and infrastructure as potential area for fostering ties. We hope to curate each webinar, keeping the overarching aim of our study in mind, reflected through key webinar themes. Our previous two webinars have led to insightful discussions between leading experts on specific areas of corporate governance that revealed common concerns emerging for both nations to address. One such expert, but in the area of sports governance, will be moderating this particular webinar today. The webinar is on the representation of women in sports governance. It gives me great joy to introduce our lead moderator, Professor Shah, Associate Professor at Jindal Global Law School and Director at the Center for Sports Law, Business and Governance. Professor Shah also serves on the board of Judo Australia, having spent more than 10 years residing and working in India for a leading law firm and leader for key sports organizations. Professor Shah understands India like no other, a hardworking and meticulous academic who I have had a privilege to work with. Professor Shah has been instrumental in strengthening bilateral networks, particularly in education between India and Australia. With this, I am delighted to hand over the baton to Professor Shah to take the discussion forward.
Thank you so much for that very warm and generous introduction, Divyangana, and a big thank you for dialing in from North America, where I believe it's the early hours of the morning as well. We truly have an international panel for everyone today, from Canada to India to Australia and several different cities. So thanks for everyone for joining us, and thank you to you, Divyangana, for your leadership for this Australian government grant. It's a very exciting an important project, not just focusing typically with what we look at in terms of bilateral relationships about trade and geopolitics, but very important issues that impact both of our countries and sort of social challenges and cultural norms. And this particular project that we're looking at in this series of webinars is looking at the participation of women on boards, not just on sport boards, which we're looking at today, but from a corporate governance perspective as well. And from today's webinar's perspective, we really do have an exciting list of speakers, each of whom I'll introduce shortly. And our speakers come from a range of sports boards, different sports across Australia and India, from different backgrounds, whether it be academia, NGO background, or as sports lawyers, or former sports lawyers, as one or two of them might remind us. And the different perspectives that I'm sure we'll get today are going to be fantastic. And we might hear some very useful and interesting statistics when it comes to female participation on boards. And we've heard the quote before, you can't be what you can't see. And we often hear this in the context of female participation in sport. And what I mean by that is female participation on the sports field. So if I look at Australia and we see the increase in female participation in Australian football, in cricket, and the professionalisation of these leagues, that's certainly been a big aspect of seeing these sports on television, for example, and live in stadia, which we had not seen, previously before many of these, to the same extent. And Margot, who will speak shortly, will probably tell you about her background, which is a case in point of this very phenomenon. But also, you can't be what you can't see surely relates to who are the representatives on boards in our national sport federations and state sports federations and even international sporting federations and other bodies. So really looking forward to perspectives from our panelists here insofar as are women represented on boards in sport? Are there obstacles? What can we do to kind of promote further participation on boards and on the sporting field as well, from the perspective of gender diversity, which is really what we're talking about throughout the webinar today. Now, there'll be plenty of time for questions, so I'll invite our students and other participants and audience members to write down questions in the Q&A as and when your questions come, and we'll moderate a question and answer session towards the end of our session today. But to start with, I'll invite each of our speakers to say some general comments in terms of their perspectives of women on boards in sport and gender diversity on boards, and perhaps what the opportunities and challenges are in a modern day perspective. Just to set the scene somewhat, a couple of colleagues of mine and co-authors from Deakin University, in fact, published an article late last year in Managing Sport and Leisure on board composition, board size, gender diversity on boards, wherein we crunched some numbers, who's actually sitting on boards. And one of the stark contrasts between Australia and India in national sport federations was the fact that almost 40% of women, or 40% of board members on national sport federations in Australia were women, which is somewhat of an improvement over the last decade. In India, that number was 7% or thereabouts. So there's quite a significant gap statistically. And I know one of our panelists, at least one of our panelists, will be drawing on other statistics in this field. And with that in mind, we're very interested to hear the perspectives of our first speaker, Margot Foster, who is a former Olympic rower for Australia and a former Olympic medalist, in fact, in rowing, and a Commonwealth gold medalist in rowing. And this was a former career, perhaps, Margot, when it comes to, because your experience in sport governance spans, and I believe a number of decades subsequently, where you were trained as a lawyer and following that have been on numerous high-profile sport governing bodies, including presently as a director of Motorsport Australia, the first female vice president of that board, but of course as a board member previously in Australian Sport Commission, Gymnastics Australia, Sport New Zealand, and the list goes on. I don't want to eat up all the time introducing you, but you've got a vast experience as both an athlete, a sports lawyer, and a board member. So I'm not sure how you're going to fit all these perspectives into sort of a 7-minute introduction, but I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sure you're up for the challenge. And with that, I'll introduce you now to say a few words to introduce the topic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sean, for that introduction. And yes, my career has spanned my rowing days when I was on some boards, and then in my lawyer days when I was on some boards as well. But I am delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. Let me see. Too much talking about women's leadership in sport is never enough, I say. So noting the time available for each of us, I will begin. I look forward to hearing from my fellow panellists and to questions later on. Thought I'd start with one of the beginnings for me, which was in 1991, the second ever Women's Sport Conference was held in Australia. It followed a landmark 1998 report by a federal parliamentarian into media coverage of women's sport. Out of that conference came lots of enthusiasm and excitement amongst those of us who attended about the opportunities that lay before women in a range of sports leadership and governance roles. I was one of that excited group which founded Women's Sport Australia, the first advocacy group of its type. I had by that time been appointed to a number of high-profile boards, as Sean mentioned, and often I was the only woman, or perhaps one of two or three where the other women were on the board by virtue of organisation positions. Strangely, it never occurred to me that I was the only one. And I might have noticed it, but I was never troubled by it and never felt that as an only woman, my voice was stifled or that I couldn't add my voice to the conversation. I took it in my stride whenever a chairman opened the meeting as Margot and gentlemen, which was certainly preferable to lady and gentleman. It happened quite a lot. In the mid-1990s, governance training was introduced for sports organisations. Up till then, it was pretty much work it out as you go. So what I learned then by listening and observing has stood me in very good stead. Much has changed and most board meetings would never now dare go for 2 days as they did back in those days. As the 1991 conference chair said, the purpose of the event was to equip women with leadership skills to take them into high-level sports positions and boardrooms previously inaccessible. So 30 years on, what does Australia's sports leadership look like? Greg Blood, who conducts an annual survey of board CEOs and chairs, has analysed those positions going back to the late 90s, early 2000s period, and has chosen 45 peak sports bodies to look at. I've chosen several just to highlight the transition or the role of women on those boards in that period. So just quickly, but for your information, the Australian Sports Commission has had 5 chairs and one woman. And there's currently a female chair of the Australian Sports Commission. It's had 6 CEOs, of whom one has been a woman. So a total of 2 out of 11 positions in 20 odd years have been held by women. Likewise, the Australian Olympic Committee has had 1 out of 6 with one CEO and only 1 chair. Swimming Australia has had 14 positions and with a total of 4 women of those 14. And that currently Swimming Australia has both a woman as chair and CEO. Athletics Australia has only had 1 woman, currently the chair, out of 6 chairs, and no women out of 6 CEOs. Hockey Australia has had 2 women out of 10 positions, with 2 chairs of Hockey Australia and no female CEOs. Likewise, Rowing Australia, my sport, has had 8 positions, chair and CEO, and no women. Tennis Australia has had 1 out of 6, with the current chair a woman. And likewise, Squash Australia has had 1 woman out of 12 positions, and she is the current chair. So the representation is not fantastic. I then did the calculation of the number of chair positions held, which obviously varies from sport to sport. But over those 20 odd years, there have been 225 opportunities to be a chair of one of the 45 national sport organisation peak bodies. And women have held 44 of those 225 positions. And currently there are a total of 12 women who are current chairs. I noted that 14 of these 44 women are in sports that might be considered women's sports: netball, artistic swimming, and pony club. Indeed, netball's never had a man hold a senior role as a chair or CEO. I did the same comparison for the 45 CEOs, a total of 200 CEO roles, Men have held 158 and women 42, and presently there are 7 women CEOs of peak bodies. The numbers don't reflect the reality on the ground in sport, where women and girls have been playing sport forever, and increasing numbers as formerly men-only sports such as Australian rules football and rugby league have become options. But so many choose not to take a step into admin or leadership roles for many reasons which have been analysed and passed over the decades. There is much written about the benefits to organisations of having women on boards, and in the interest of time, I won't recite them as I'm sure they're familiar to you all. I did read an interesting piece this morning about Mary Barra, who's the CEO of General Motors in the US. Since her appointment in 2014, the car manufacturer has begun associating leadership qualities like decisiveness and assertiveness with women throughout the company. It just shows that it takes time, but change can happen to attitudes. My focus is on equipping women for director roles with a sound understanding of practical governance founded on the must-know, need-to-know fundamentals, to give them the knowledge that enables them to be confident at the board table and fully able to participate, knowing they are as equal as the captain of industry at the top of the table, that each director has one voice and one vote. I created a training program to make sure those who join me learn all the things I was never taught about being an effective director, which are still the things that aren't widely written about. My program focuses on storytelling and conversation, both of which make the world go round. It is so heartening when they report back about the things that they've been able to apply and the confidence generated by the application of new knowledge. Now's the time to think differently about how to get women into leadership and governance roles. So here are a few thoughts. One is not so new, and that's the introduction of quotas. Politically and ideologically, they're not everyone's cup of tea. In Victoria, my state in Australia, we had a requirement by the 1st of July 2019, all sports bodies which received government funding were required to have not fewer than 40% of women on their boards. Some took a while to get there, but in the end, just about every organisation did. It shows that there were women who were available and able to take on the roles. A softer version of quotas is targets, and many organisations adopt targets with a view to achieving them over time. But they're probably easy to stretch out if the circumstances aren't just quite right. I've done quite a lot of work with nominations committees for various boards, and I think that they're an excellent way for sports organisations to try and find women, or at least give women the opportunity to be assessed as being capable of being on boards. There are processes which you can do for both elected and appointed directors. Obviously, elected directors are subject to the votes of members at the AGM, and politics do come into play. But certainly it's a great opportunity for nominations committee based on board skills matrices to make suggestions and recommendations about appointing women to certain positions. Juanita, I think, will talk more about constitution amendment, but that is one way to make more opportunities for women, increase the number of appointed positions for each board through the constitution, and to specify a minimum number or percentage of each gender. I've also been wondering lately about adopting a different approach for position descriptions for board roles. So often they're standard, you must do this, this and the other, be all things to all people, and have skills across a wide range of areas. I've been wondering whether or not it might be useful to ask questions of candidates as part of their nomination to try and elicit a greater depth and encourage greater enthusiasm by women for applying for roles where they otherwise might think they're not a valid candidate. And I think we've all heard of the study where women won't apply if they think they can only do 4 out of 10, when men who can do 4 out of 10 still apply for positions. I think that might provide an interesting avenue for considering the cognitive diversity of women too, which is highly valued by many boards which do have a number of women on them. Blind auditions, a bit difficult, of course. So it's done for an orchestra, and suddenly the people on the panel who were interviewing candidates for an orchestra realised women could play once they were behind the screen, and they weren't using their biases or being subject to their biases and choosing the chaps. I'm sure there must be AI out there somewhere that can create a neutral voice to convert in real time. I can't change social media and people's use of it, nor can I change the nastiness of trolls. But I did read yesterday that women who are abused and trolled online withdraw into themselves and then don't put their hands up for leadership positions. We have an Office of E-Safety, which found in a report that a quarter of the women it surveyed said gendered abuse had made them reluctant to take a public-facing leadership position. The Commissioner said they will avoid stepping into leadership positions that require an online presence and have ceased discussing topics online they might feel come across as opinionated or inflammatory. This is of great concern as it's likely to affect potentially affect the appetite of young women who could be the leaders of the future. Obviously, with technology, board meetings can be held anywhere at any time of the day, not just after work. So why not lunchtime or mid-afternoon instead of evenings, and just make it more accessible and easier for women to participate? The tap on the shoulder is one of the easiest ways to obtain a board seat for many. I've been a fortunate beneficiary of that approach on several occasions, but it really doesn't cut the mustard, and I think we need to encourage men to get out more into out of their comfy circles. I'm reminded of what the president of Cathay Financial Holdings said at the end of January. The board of Taiwan's largest financial company includes 12 men and 1 woman because he can't find qualified female directors. He said, we know we need to increase female board members, but we dare not do so if there are no right candidates. The chairman told me to look for ideal female candidates for independent directors, but I can't find any. Obviously, that chap needs to get out more. And finally, perhaps there is an open sesame word, and perhaps it is this one. I received a lovely list of thank you notes the other day from a young woman in her 20s. I'd given her some advice about a year ago, not knowing if anything I'd said to her meant anything or if she'd recall anything that I had said. But maybe this is a suggestion. Sara said, after you inspired me to say yes and go to every event, even if I didn't know anyone, I joined a leadership network. This led to the opportunity to apply to be on a wellbeing executive. While the opportunity did not suit at the time with my studies, it was an honour to be considered, and that would never have been possible without saying yes. I've since become a member on another program and attended an IWD breakfast last year. Having been to these events, I've been able to strengthen my networking skills. After attending a mentor session and discussing my recent psychology honours project with the mentor, despite the fact that she's not my actual mentor, she offered me a position to intern at her clinic. After receiving this offer just this morning, I said to Dad, who introduced me to his daughter, none of this would have happened, none of this would have been possible without Margot's advice and push to move out of my comfort zone and just say yes. So there's just a few thoughts on women in leadership and government, where we've come from, where we're going, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions come the time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Margot. And I've certainly furiously been scribbling notes to come back to a few of those points, which I'm sure we will shortly. Plenty of food for thought for our next speakers to touch on. And I think you gave a couple of good segues to our next speaker, Juanita. I'll quickly introduce Juanita, who will perhaps give a bit more of the legal perspective that you spoke about. So Juanita is a senior associate at Mullins Lawyers currently, where she specialises in the sports law space. But she also wears a number of other hats in the sports industry, including as a board member for Cricket Queensland, and director of Queensland Rugby League Southeast Region. And Juanita was also the first female CEO of an NBL, a National Basketball League club in Australia, which is fantastic. And she's actively involved in the Queensland community in the sports law space. Just I think it was last week or the week before, we attended a conference at Bond University on the area of sports law, in fact. So looking forward to your views on the subject, Juanita. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Sean. And I get the lucky slot after the wonderful Margot Foster. So thank you for scheduling me in straight after Margot. But thank you so much for having me today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. There's so much meaty stuff we can talk about. And I plan to speak a lot about my own personal experiences and perspectives on the topic rather than stats and whatnot, which I know will follow. Just to give a bit of context, the board roles that I currently hold, as you mentioned, Queensland Cricket firstly. So we're a member of Cricket Australia, and our responsibilities cover all of community cricket in Queensland and high performance, but also the commercial arm, which is the Brisbane Heat women and men in the BBL, or the Big Bash in Australia, T20 competition. So cricket's definitely a love of both India and Australia, and we've had the Indian women's team as well as the men's team out here recently, and certainly, which I'll touch on a bit later, a few women players in our WBBL tournament for the first time just recently, so which is fantastic. On that board, we've got 9 directors, 6 which are elected by members and 3 which are appointed, and of those 9, 2 of us are women. The other board I sit on currently is Queensland Rugby League South East Division, and we look after the game of rugby league, particularly community rugby league in South East Queensland, which is Brisbane, Gold Coast, Ipswich. And that area is pretty much the largest geographical area of rugby league registrations in Australia, and probably close to internationally. It sits under a Queensland Rugby League board, and we have 10 directors, and of those 10, there is a number, 6 I think are elected, and 3 are appointed through virtue of their positions on other boards, and the rest are appointed. And of those 10, there are 3 women. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of the context of the boards that I'm sitting on. And I have to say that all my board experiences have been positive, and I'm very grateful for that, because I know that in a lot of other circumstances that might not be the case. And certainly in my job as a sports lawyer during the day, I've seen a lot of dysfunctional committees and boards and issues come across our desk. When I was reflecting on the topic, it really reminded me of the legal industry in many ways, because as our probably fellow sports lawyers on the panel would attest to, when I was a young lawyer graduating from uni, 20 so years ago, every partner in the firm that I graduated to was male. There were very few females to look up to and aspire to, and that's certainly changed completely now. So, these days there is quite a lot of female partners in firms. In Australia, we have a female Chief Justice of the High Court, we have a female of the Queensland Supreme Court, 50-50 at least lawyers coming through the system are women, and certainly at university, I think the higher proportion of students these days are females. So it really has changed, but that's taken a generation. And I think that sport might be similar in that we want change and we can see it happening, but it's very slow. And so this actually might be a whole generational change to get where we want to, but certainly the legal industry would have been considered very traditional and archaic in many ways, and certainly now the leadership of females in that industry is quite significant. Personally, I have a really strong belief in the importance of sport in our community, and that's in part due to the value to our communities locally. We saw when COVID hit and we locked down, a lot of our social networks for families and for children were taken away from us because we couldn't play sport. And, that's certainly apart from the other benefits we all know about, such as physical and health benefits and lessons for our children, such as teamwork and whatnot. So the reason I make those points is those values that we see as so important in sport aren't just confined to the men in sport. So, you know, they are just as relevant to our females in sport. So there is absolutely no reason why females wouldn't or shouldn't have that same input in relation to those important topics. And I don't, as far as the rise of women's sport in Australia, certainly over the last probably 5 or so years, there has been significant growth in female sport and the visibility and participation, certainly at an elite level at least, because we've always had a strong participation at grassroots. So it's certainly made women in sport, I think, in Australia more visible in their different capacities, not only playing, but also in administration and governance roles as well. And that's certainly a great thing to see. From a business perspective, I think people have recognised now commercially there is value in women's sport to be had, and we'll see sponsors really seeing opportunities in investing in women's sport and getting that exposure. So, you know, this is all part of that generational change that I mentioned before of women becoming more visible. My son is 9 and he knows nothing different than seeing women on TV playing sport or reffing sport, or mum going to a board meeting, or women in administrative roles. So, you know, that's certainly different to the generation above him. So I think that's all really important. With respect to barriers of women in sports governance roles, probably touching on something that Margot briefly brought up on, I was recently asked the question whether it was the fact that women were applying and not being successful in their applications, or whether women just weren't actually applying. And it's a really good question, because I agree with Margot that a lot of women will tend not to apply if personally they feel, oh, I'll never get it, or I don't have quite all the right criteria that I fit, so I just won't apply. But I encourage people that might be having that thought process to actually apply, because if you don't have those applications out there, the people that are assessing them will never know that the wealth of experience and talent of women there are there. They won't appreciate that. So by putting the applications in, it's only going to help that process. For me personally, I made a number of applications before I was fortunate enough to join the 2 boards I'm on at the moment, and was unsuccessful. But I really valued that experience, because I think the things that I learned in those unsuccessful applications, by the time I was able to tailor it and nail it, it really helped me get the role, particularly in Queensland cricket that I'm on now. So those unsuccessful applications were really important in my learning and in my ability to do a great job now. So for those reasons, I'd really encourage more females to put their hat in the ring and apply, even if they don't, you know, think that they're a shoo-in. No one ever is. So it's really a worthwhile exercise to do. I think also too, a lot of women in high-profile roles can sometimes attract an uneven level of criticism compared to their male compatriots, particularly for irrelevant things such as appearance. And the one that came to mind when I was thinking about this topic was Raylene Castle, who is the CEO of Australia Rugby Union and also an NRL club in Australia, and certainly had a quite extraordinary amount of criticism in the media and social media directed to her, which I think her equivalent colleagues were not susceptible to. And, you know, that certainly, I think, is a reason that that can put females off putting themselves out there in that position, which is really unfortunate. Many constitutions of sporting bodies, and we know sporting bodies are quite unique, so many constitutions are quite unique and quirky. And, you know, we have particular processes and requirements as far as composition of board directors and the process of their appointment, whether that be by election or by appointment as an independent director, and as Margot touched on, nominations committee. So I think it can be quite relevant when you have a male-dominated sport and at this point in time, a large male membership, that it doesn't take a genius to realise that those elected positions are probably more likely going to be skewed towards male nominations and male being voted by males for those elected positions. But in the area of those nominated positions, it's a real opportunity for women to be put forward by their merits. And I've had the opportunity also to sit on some nominations committee, and as Margot mentioned, it's a great experience and a way to get more women involved. But all of us agree that women should be there on their merits. I don't think anyone disagrees with that whatsoever, but it certainly enables that even playing field process. And I think for us women that are on boards, being involved in those sort of subcommittees and nominations committees helps. It helps the setting the right standard and removing incorrect biases going forward. So there's certainly opportunity there. As far as enablers to increase the level of participation of women in sports governance roles, I certainly believe that women currently in leadership roles should fly the flag but also just do the job they know they're capable of, because actions will speak louder than words in many respects. And we know that there are many, many capable women, and by doing that job and showing that they can do that just sets the example for those that follow, and people that look at them recognise that yes, women are more than capable of doing these jobs. And I feel as a woman in that position that I want to share my experience and knowledge and bring others with me. And I know when I first met Margot many years ago, she's been a great point of contact for me over those years too. So I think it's important for us in those positions to share our knowledge and increase our network and our experiences. There are certainly a number of formal programs in Australia that help in that respect. So some professional firms have various women in sport leadership programs. There's mentoring networks such as Minerva Network, which connects female businesswomen with athletes, helping them with the non-performance on the field side of things with their life and career. From my own experiences in Queensland, we have an informal directors group. So all the female directors of the major sporting codes based in Brisbane and in Queensland will get together quite often just to share experiences and host each other and provide a network to each other. Likewise, cricket in Australia will also have regular catch-ups online over the last 18 months, certainly, where the female directors of all the states in cricket, as well as Cricket Australia and the Players Association, the ACA, will all get together and provide that network. But I do think it's also very important to not become too female-centric in those support groups and make sure that we have male champions of change that also are on the ride as such. And I know that Margot hosts a lunch quite regularly, or I think twice a year or once a year in Melbourne, which is fantastic. And I'm hoping to get there after COVID. The barriers are lifted, where each attendee is required to bring along a male. So it's not just a ladies' lunch, it's bringing in those men to spread the word and to be male champions of change. So I think that's just a fantastic initiative. I won't talk too much on quotas because I know Johanna is going to speak a little bit about them shortly. But as far as from a legal point of view, as I said before, I think we all agree that women should be appointed on and are appointed on their merit. I personally had been a little bit uncomfortable with quotas myself and getting my head around them for that reason. But the challenge that was put to me is that without the quotas, those merit applications aren't happening because of, I guess, biases remaining a barrier for women being appointed. So my hope personally is that quotas will do their job and we will have that representation of females on boards that we know is of value and is on merit. And then in the future, we won't need quotas because they have done their job and they can then be removed. We certainly are able from a legal point of view to hardwire constitutions, as Margot alluded to, putting in minimum requirements for for example, females, or even, I guess, not only male-female quotas, but also trying to increase diversity in boards. It's not only gender, it's also age, it's also race, it's also different experiences. But there is certainly the ability to hardwire constitutions for organisations in that respect. And digging a little deeper also in respect of your elected directors and your appointed directors. You've got much more, well, control's not the right word, but elected members are exactly that on behalf of the members, where in a nominations committee and appointed directors, you have that ability to bring in that diversity a little bit more where you might not have that control. I guess my thoughts on that too are, in the future, you would hope that you wouldn't need to hardwire constitutions, because the diversity will be a natural thing in those boards, but it's certainly a possibility to do that. So I don't know how I'm going for time, but I suppose just in summary, I think we've come a long way. Quite fascinating, listening to those first original conferences that you mentioned, Margot, and, I think though we still have a long way to go. We're not where we want to be as far as representation of women in sports governance yet, but we're certainly on the way. And, I guess I look forward to the day where my 9-year-old son that I mentioned before can, I can tell him tales of when we had these sort of workshops with these topics and seminars, and they just don't have them anymore because there's no need to. So, as I said, it's a generational change and we're on the way. So look forward to having a further chat and hearing my other speakers and answering any questions shortly.
Thank you so much, Juanita, and both for sharing your journey and also providing those rich insights into the enablers, the challenges, and one wonders what this workshop would have been like when Margot, when you were competing in the 80s and sort of getting involved in sport governance, and what it will be like in another 20 or 30 years, Juanita, as you were alluding to. So hopefully we are on that journey and we're heading in the right direction. And we've certainly seen that from an Australian perspective, I think, and are seeing that. And perhaps our next speaker, Dr. Johanna, can shed some light on some statistics about that journey and putting it, Australia and India in context from an empirical perspective. So I'll invite Dr. Johanna to speak. Dr. Johanna is an associate professor, an expert in sports management at the University of Technology, Sydney, UTS, and was the convener of the 5th World Conference on Women and Sport in Sydney some years ago, which did some groundbreaking work in establishing the Sydney Scoreboard Global Index for Women in Sport Leadership. And she's been recognised by a number of institutions for her contribution to women's sport and leadership in women in sport. So really looking forward to your insights. Johanna, over to you now.
Thank you, Sean, for a very kind introduction. Well, I will, in my presentation, I give a quite different perspective. Margot and Juanita have mostly talked about their own experience and the Australian situation. I'll focus on women's participation in sports governance at an international level. And I've actually just completed a study tracking women on the boards of international sport federations for 10 years. And I'd like to share with you some of the key findings. And why this is important is because what happens at an international level that influences, of course, the developments at a national level and vice versa. So in 2012, I started this research journey, and it started with the Sydney Scoreboard, as Sean alluded to. And my team and I did an audit of the gender distribution on boards of 70 international federations. And they were member of the Global Association for International Sport Federations. So that is the umbrella organization that promotes and represents the international sport federations. And we collected data on 3 key indicators. first of all, on the number of women directors as part of the total directors. And then we looked at the gender of the president. So if the president, sometimes also called chair, was male or female. And similarly, the gender of the Secretary General. And usually the most senior management position at an international federation is called the Secretary General, but also they are sometimes called General Manager or Chief Executive Officer. Now this audit we repeated in 2016 and late last year. So that was a 10-year tracking. Now some of the results, well, first of all, with regard to the women directors, they increased from 11% in 2012 to 21% late last year. Now that is an increase of 10%, yeah, over the last decade. This is substantial. Now only 2 of the AIFFs, so 2 of the 70 AIFFs, they achieved gender balance on their board. And with gender balance, we define that as a minimum of 40% of either gender. And Margot will be pleased to know that one of the federations was World Rowing. And the other federation that achieved gender balance was World Sailing. Now another 16 AIFFs, they achieved a critical mass of women on their boards. And that is defined as a minimum of 30% and an absolute number of 3 women. And that we know that normalizes the gender dynamics on the board. And there is a very nice quote that says, allowing women to speak and contribute more freely and men to listen with more open minds. And that was Conrad and some of her associates who researched that on corporate boards. Now, the other thing that I want to note that is that some of the larger, the influential sports traditionally played by men only, they still have a very low percentage of women directors. For example, a sport popular in cricket, I just heard in India, cricket had only one woman on the has only one woman currently on the International Cricket Council. So that is 6%. And football, for example, has 16%. Now you notice that is well below the average. For remember, the average is currently 21%. Now the fact that football has improved a lot, for years it had only one person too, is because they have introduced quotas. And we've heard already a bit more about it, and I'll come back to that later. Now, lesson number 1 learned from this is that although the participation of women directors has increased by 10% over the last decade, gender balance and achieving a critical mass of women on boards, that has mostly not yet been achieved on the majority of international sport federations. Now, what about women presidents and the secretary generals? Well, women presidents has also risen over the last decade, but only from 7% to 9%. So in other words, 91% of all the presidents of the international federations are men. Now that is staggering. Women secretary generals over the last decade from 8% to 24%. Now that is encouraging, and that is the biggest change we have seen out of the 3 key indicators. And that brings us to lesson number 2, as I may call it, that key leadership positions for women largely remain elusive, still remain elusive. However, the dramatic increase that we have seen at the level of the Secretary General, that bodes well for women's participation in sport governance, because they are the pipeline for future directors. Now you may ask, which sports are governed by a woman president? Well, listen to this. It is underwater sports. It is sled dog sports. It is curling and squash. So in other words, mostly not so popular sport with a very small participation base, relatively speaking. And then what about the sports with a female Secretary General? Well, again, that are a number of the less influential sports such as bobsleigh, skeleton, sport climbing, tug of war. I even didn't know that tug of war had an international federation, but apparently they do. And water ski and wakeboard. However, and this is interesting, there are a few popular Olympic sports that do have a secretary, a woman as a Secretary General. One of them is football, and she's also a colored woman. The other one is cycling, another one handball, which is of course hugely popular in Europe, and also equestrian. So there is a mixture. So that brings me to lesson number 3, and that is the change for women's representation on boards of the larger, more prestigious AIFFs. It's much more difficult to obtain than the smaller, less popular sports and non-Olympic sports. Now, finally then, and this is the key question, how can we accelerate change? And the first one, and I come back to what Margot mentioned and Juanita, do consider quotas. And the big difference that hasn't been mentioned yet between targets and quotas, and I'm talking about quotas, not targets, because quotas, they are legally binding. As we have heard from one of the previous speakers, if they are not met, there are penalties. For example, funding are not given out. And it is, although there are many disadvantages of quotas, and Juanita has also mentioned that already, it is effective if you want to have a quick change and at least get a number of women's voices on board. It's a very effective way. And then indeed, at a later stage, we can perhaps remove that quota rule in a constitution. Now, my second recommendation is recruit more women in senior sport management and sport admin positions. And it can be, as the other speaker mentioned, by nomination commissions or so. But they are the pipeline for future directors, or one of the pipelines for future directors. Yeah. Now, and the third recommendation is monitor and keep monitoring the gender distribution on boards, on the sport boards. Publish the data, yeah, for transparency and also for keeping the federations and the organizations, the sport organizations accountable. And then, for example, we see so many other organizations, they do get a critical mass or they do have a gender balance. And then all the traditional male-dominated boards, they might want to change also to keep up with the times. Well, that was all I wanted to say at this stage. Thank you for the opportunity to present, and I look forward to the conversation later.
Johanna, some really rich insights from an international federation perspective, which can really, well, some of them are staggering, the low figures, particularly of presidents and chairs, but we do see some improvement over the last decade, which, to paraphrase you, it is encouraging. So some of those lessons are quite interesting, and I wonder, and perhaps we discuss this at the end, how some of those could be applied at a national federation level and state federation level as well. But we can come back to that. So thank you so much. That you know, sometimes well, as academics, I think it's very important, but also policymakers, that we're not only guided by anecdotes and the experiences of one, but but understanding this empirical evidence is critical in guiding policy decisions and how we move forward. So really interested to come back to how we can use that data and those learnings moving forward as well. So, which brings me to our next jurisdiction. We've heard now two of our speakers focusing on the Australian perspective. Johanna has kind of provided us a fantastic segue with the international perspective. And now we're going to move to our next speaker, Sara Pilot, to speak more so from an Indian perspective. I know football was mentioned a couple of times. So again, that's kind of some good ammunition for you, Sara, to talk about football and women participation in football and leadership. We'll shortly hear from Anjali also. So we'll be getting a lot about football throughout today. But to introduce you, Sara Pilot, of course, is the chairperson of the Women's Committee on the All India Football Federation, AIFF, and doing some fantastic work in women's football, which is a fast-growing sport from an Indian perspective. Johanna mentioned cricket, but of course, football is certainly fast-growing. And Sara's also done some phenomenal work at an NGO and social enterprise level from an Indian perspective through the Centre for Equity and Inclusion, which promotes equal rights for women and girls. And I've heard her speak on this, which is probably a conversation for another day, but perhaps you can bring some of that in through your talk too. But interested, Sara, to hear about your journey, the importance of female representation on boards, on sport boards from an Indian perspective, and also women in sport generally in India. Over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you to OP Jindal Global University for giving me this opportunity to speak and share some thoughts. As far as the AIFF is concerned, unfortunately, at the moment, we're in the middle of a legal kind of situation. I won't go into great detail on it, but there's a case that's in court. So for the last couple of years, while of course the federation is functioning and as much as could happen because of COVID, as such, it's also been a very tricky situation to do anything new or very exciting, which I found to be frustrating because of this kind of court order. So at the moment, things are just going along in a routine way, and we haven't really been able to do anything very new. So I'm hoping that this year, maybe we'll have some clarity and we will have, fresh elections so that we can really move forward, and there's so much to do. Of course, when I joined the AIFF, and it's a similar story to Margot, but I think I was much more overwhelmed by the fact that I sat in this room and it was literally just a sea of men and just me. Over the years, it's changed. There have been a few more women when I look out and see who's there. More now in administration. We have Anjali Shah, who I was thrilled when she was nominated on the board because it was another woman there with me. So, that feeling that a woman is placed on the board as, okay, we need to tick the box and we need to have X, Y, Z, as whatever the numbers are in order to fulfill our constitutional requirement. And I think that, of course, while it is absolutely essential to get the women on that board, I mean, there's been so much conversation here about quota and things like that. But at least for me, it did begin, and it definitely was that I had to push that perspective. I had to remind everybody in the room that when we were having the meeting, it was always, there was no question of even saying anything about men's football. The entire conversation, everything was spoken about. It was tournaments, it was budgets, it was this, it was that. And everybody knew that we are talking about men's football. We are not talking about women's football. And maybe in the last 1 or 2 minutes, it would be, okay, let's give a quick, is there anything that's happening with the women, or a quick idea of what is the women's team doing? And, Sara, do you have any comment that you'd like to add? this has changed. It's not quite like that. But it's something where, for example, we had a very exciting partnership with Coca-Cola, and they were going to be doing so many trainings for children across India, and it sounded really fantastic. And so I kind of had to put my hand up and say, is this boys and girls, or, you know, who are we talking about here? And it was only boys. And somehow nobody in the room thought to even mention, or, you know, when we talk to Coca-Cola, could we have some kind of system where the girls can also play? It just, I'm not saying that anyone was against it, but somehow it just didn't cross anybody's mind. So I think even this thing of gendered, sex disaggregated data hardly exists. And it's very frustrating because, you know, when we're talking about budgets, when we're talking about programs such as this, I'm not able to get those figures that, okay, you know, it's really exciting that you have a golden league, or you have this baby league, or various things that are being institutionalized. But how many girls are playing? How many boys are playing? How are you spending your money? Very gender blind, where they will tell me, well, it's open to everyone. You know, I mean, it's a Saturday, it's a Sunday, it's a camp. We're not going to turn the girls away. But trying to explain to them, and of course, I have that gender background, and I'm so fortunate that, of course, I am at the AIFF, but as Sean mentioned, I have an NGO, which I've co-founded about 12 years ago, and we work for the empowerment and the equality of women and girls. And so trying to explain to people that just because you say that girls are also welcome on a Sunday to come to the stadium, it's not enough. It's, if you do something in school and the girls are in schools, yes, it's easier because you have that kind of captive audience. But unfortunately, who is going to bring that girl to the stadium? The boys, you know, we're talking about private spaces, public spaces, who can access that space. Much easier for the boys to head out, take the metro, take a cycle and come. For the girls, it's so difficult in our country to even go to school at the best of times. Going for a football camp, unless you're really going out there and working in the community and persuading the parents, it's not going to happen. You may get those, you know, token 1 or 2 girls who are so passionate about it, or whose brother's going along, so maybe the sister kind of hitches a ride. Otherwise, if you say that, well, naturally whatever happens, it's not going to happen. And that's why we need women on our boards, and it goes from every level in order to have these voices heard. You know, we had, for example, the under-17 FIFA tournament that was played here in there was a fantastic legacy program and this coffee table book that they released and things like that. But again, no sex disaggregated data. But in this legacy program, how many girls were impacted? There was no thought really given to the fact that if we've held the boys under 17s, then we can just as easily bid to host the girls under 17s. And I really had to personally push for that. We have a National Alliance for Women's Football in India, which CEQUIN is the convener for that. And we as the Alliance really had to push for that if we've had such a successful under 17s for boys, why not for the girls? Unfortunately, because of COVID, that keeps getting pushed, and we're hoping that it's going to happen this year. But again, constantly having to remind everyone about that, you know, don't forget that the girls and the women are there, and constantly reminding everyone that it needs to be top of the agenda, not just, you know, that last one little line that we have to do because we shouldn't just forget to mention it. So we need to pin people down. Anjali and I definitely in the AIFF committee meetings, we raise our voices, we ask those awkward questions. I think there's no other way of going about it. And that determination has to be there. Unfortunately, in India, again, this is not just about sports bodies and sports federation. It's a much wider, much deeper topic. If we look at even labor force participation at the moment, it is extremely upsetting to see what our figures are at the moment. I think in 2005, we were at about 39%. These are WTO figures. And now at the national level, it's fallen to 19%. And in Delhi, the national capital, we are at an appalling 10%, lower than Pakistan, something like on par with sub-Saharan Africa. So if we're talking about, women in sports bodies, we don't even have women who are participating in the workplace. So, all these conversations can't be had in isolation. And I feel very grateful to be able to have my background with my NGO, seeing those girls on the ground. Why is it that when I run a program, for example, in the heart of Old Delhi, in a very conservative area, we've only been running this program, it's relatively new, for the last 2 or 3 months. And we've had already 200 girls come out and play, and they come consistently. It's not rocket science. And we've had like thousands of girls who've come out and played and stuck with it. So it's not impossible. This whole thing about, the dropout, and the girls come and then they drop out, and we'll throw our hands up and say there's nothing we can do because now they're going to go and get married, or their parents are not giving them permission to play. You have to make the effort. And I think that the onus constantly being put on the girls is very unfair, because they want to play and they want to develop their skills. And it's for us to ensure that it's not just about the girls playing. It's about, and this is something that we do at CEQUIN in a very focused way, is it's not just about getting them out to play in large numbers, but about developing their capacity in order to keep progressing. So, all the kind of career guidance, leadership programs, getting them to have the opportunity to go for D-license coaching, and then going further up into their coaching careers as referees. And then all those things give them that experience to go into administration, and one hopes to then join things like state associations and boards. Within my NGO, for example, I have a girl, her name is Mala, and she came from the slums of an area, a very, very poor area of Delhi, on the banks of the river, which is flooded pretty much every year. She would lose her home every year. And she started coming to play football with us when she was maybe about 12 or 13. And we managed to secure a scholarship for her in Gujarat. And she went there and she started the first girls team in the university. She came back to Delhi. She then did her license, D-license coach. And last year, she's now a full-time employee of CEQUIN. And it's wonderful how she's come full circle. She's now a program manager. So she plans, everything to do with our football program. And we've seen a massive improvement. The girls who come out and play, they really look up to her. And I think Sean kind of started off with this, is that they now see her and they can aspire to something. And their families also look at Mala and they see that, okay, if we invest in our girl, or at least, we allow our daughters, that whole permission thing, if we allow our daughters to go out and play, this is something that they can make a career of. And it's something that is very exciting, and they're so proud of it. And Mala in herself now, she has that capacity and she has that capability to take this much further. So there are so many success stories, and as far as I'm concerned, it really is a no-brainer. And I don't know why there is this struggle to convince people that it's a good idea to have women on the sports boards or to have them in leadership positions. Because I think it's pretty much well known now. There are so many studies which show people that it's not just sports, but if we're talking about even corporates or businesses or anything like that, that diversity in boards is the absolute way to go. There are so many stories that we hear that when we have women on boards, profits do increase. So I think that here in India, again, trying to get away from this narrative that someone's doing us a favor, that it's a charity, like, okay, let's have some women on the board and it's so nice of us to allow them in. That whole kind of old boys club, I feel there's a little bit of that, or maybe a lot of it, this gatekeeping that we, the men, are maybe going to allow in that token woman, but otherwise we're going to keep this to ourselves. And I think there needs to be a lot of education to the sports authorities, state associations, to explain to them that actually it's for their benefit. We are then tapping into 50% of the population, which in India obviously is huge. That's, so many more eyeballs. That's so much more money that's spent. And so to ignore the girls and to ignore the women and not to really pay attention to their voices is ultimately a loss for that association or for that board. So again, I think it's not just about increasing the capacity of women and girls to get to the leadership position, but also educating the men as to why it is absolutely imperative for the women to be taking those places on the board and to listen to them and to take very seriously their input. So change is very much in the wins, but I think that we need many more women in these positions to drive that change, because if we just let it happen naturally, it's going to be far too slow. That's it for now, Sean, and of course I can answer any more questions.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and almost a call to arms there at the end as well. But some fantastic illustrations, frankly, of why diversity is so important on board. The examples you mentioned about an unconscious bias in implementing programs and policies without really thinking about its impact or their impact on young girls in the sport. But at the same time, your stories of the importance of engagement in young girls in sport and how that can impact their lives, also from a socioeconomic level, that huge impact it can have on them. So thank you for that. And if time permits, I'm sure there'll be numerous questions. I'll now invite Aahna, our next speaker, to say a few words. Aahna is one of the leading sports lawyers in India, sorry, almost said Australia, and was until recently the vice chairperson of the National Anti-Doping Disciplinary Panel. She runs she's a partner of a firm called TMT Law Practice and specializes mostly in sports law, both from a commercial perspective, disciplinary perspective, policy perspective, and even a bit of sports management, I think, as well, and has done a lot of work in the women in sports space. And there are, I don't know, Aahna, if you would agree, very few, but certainly a growing number of women in sports law in India. It's very interesting that a number of our panelists today, Juanita and Margot, have had a law background prior to serving on boards, and would be interested to hear your thoughts on the growth of women in sports law and the impact of women on sports boards and how that sort of practice is changing. But also, we've talked about quotas quite a lot from an Australian perspective. Whether it's a bit of a leading question, but whether that's reflected in India under the Indian Sports Code and various draft versions of other sports policies that are being debated. I will hand it over to you on that note. Thanks, Aahna.
Thank you, Sean, for having me. I think there's enough that's already been said, and I don't know if I really have too much new to add, because the situation, Sara, laid the foundation pretty well about what the situation is like in India, but just take a generic perspective without speaking about any sport in particular as to what the state of affairs in India is, and also throw in some stats. Of course, we'll answer your question during the question answer session. That's that. I'll begin with a quote by Benjamin Franklin. He said, "If everyone is thinking alike, then no one is thinking." He said this more than 200 years ago, illustrating that even as a very basic concept, the value found in the diversity of thought and experience was realized, if not earlier, at least since America declared its independence in 1776. Diversity in organizations, and in particular gender diversity, has positive and tangible benefits to organizational performance, culture, morale, and colleague motivation. This phenomena is especially effective when adopted at the senior leadership ranks of organizations. The desire to achieve proportionate gender representation on corporate boards is derived from the principle of equality of treatment. Equality of treatment requires comparable situations to be treated in the same manner and prohibits direct and indirect discrimination. Equality of treatment refers to either equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. For example, it has been uncovered, like Sara mentioned, that women represent at least 30% of top management, wherein women represent at least 30% of the top management. Organizations have been shown to perform significantly better than organizations without that 30%. Researchers have determined that when women are more proportionately represented in decision-making roles, their organizations have higher levels of performance and enhanced public image, greater levels of employee satisfaction, and higher levels of financial performance. This may be due to, in part, because of women bringing in diverse perspectives to decisions and/or contributing unique and creative ideas. Yet, the proportion of women in senior leadership roles in India, example, vice presidents and above, is notably small, and in some sports specifically, pretty much non-existent. In sport, as in many other industries in India, women are generally underrepresented in leadership and governance positions. This includes board appointments, executive leadership, high performance, and head coaching roles. Various reasons exist for such underrepresentations, which include a series of social, cultural, and sometimes even procedural barriers. Women remain minimally represented in senior leadership roles in sport, despite increased female participation. And that increase in participation is not just in sport, but also in sport management programs and in entry-level positions in the industry. Many women either prematurely exit mid-level leadership positions or are often overlooked for senior leadership positions. Unfortunately, women occupy less than 10% of positions in sports association and governing bodies in India. When Sidhani Patni, the first woman office bearer, who was joint secretary of the Madhya Pradesh Cricket Association, joined the body about 7 odd years ago, the workplace was entirely male dominated. Only 8 national sports associations have 8 national sports associations in India have no female representation whatsoever. Hockey India, which is pretty much an exception, has the maximum at 34%. I myself, like Sean mentioned during my introduction, I'm often regarded as the first woman sports lawyer of India. And honestly speaking, that's not a tag that I'm extremely proud to own, because I only ran a practice a decade ago. If nobody thought about this career a decade ago, certainly we were not thinking in the right direction. Well, research also shows that for a woman to build and succeed in any career in sport, she must find a role model, mentor, and sponsor, and eventually also become the same. When I went out to look for a woman mentor in sports law, clearly I found none. B, have access to networks and opportunities. C, be self-promoting. And also D, strategically build the confident career portfolio. It is believed that having role models, mentors, and sponsors are the most important activities that aspiring leaders could undertake if they seek to have careers in leadership positions. Career progression and advancement has been shaped by such role models who encourage them, support them, and open doors of opportunity for them. Networking is also identified as one of the most important strategies to assist women advance into senior leadership roles. However, part of the problem is that women in senior leadership have very few examples of female leaders to network within professional sport, and research further shows that women are generally less effective than men in utilizing networks to advance their careers. Sometimes their interest falls outside of the work environment, and often they have childcare responsibilities in India that preclude after hours and weekend networking activities. Further, in common pool resource systems which exist in sport, demographic differences have created strong divides between individuals. Such divides complicate the quality of information received, attitudes formed, and interactions experienced. Regardless of the reason, the principle, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, is not applied to sport, and women are not always afforded the same opportunities that benefit men and their career development and advancement. Ideally, what women need to do is to stop engaging in self-limiting behavior. Conversely, they need to take credit for their success. Self-limiting behavior patterns often hold women back from securing senior leadership roles and consequently reaching their aspirations as senior leaders. This behavior frequently sabotages career advancement for women, especially those seeking senior leadership roles in sport. Some of the most commonly identified barriers for women in India are A, an unsupportive environment, which can be identified largely as a structural barrier. B, limiting gender roles and sexism, a deeply ingrained cultural practice, unfortunately. C, lack of self-confidence, a capacity gap on account of inherently being made to feel so. And last but not the least, the gender pay gap, which is the financial and economic inequality. I mean, I still remember back in the day when I was playing cricket, we were not paid at all because at that point of time, women's cricket was not even under the BCCI. Women's cricket only came under BCCI in 2008 when women started to get paid about 5,000 odd rupees to play a Ranji Trophy match. But before that, I mean, we were pretty much funding ourselves to play the sport. That being said, while there is an increased awareness of the value of gender diverse leadership, this does not automatically guarantee inclusion, which is more challenging. The inequalities women face in sport stem from deep-rooted issues within its cultural and organizational practices, which privilege and normalize men in leadership positions. These practices reinforce gendered norms and can include gendered language, segregation, and ways of working, which tend to disadvantage women as primary caregivers. Women in sports. Recent research found that there is a clear gap in how women and men feel in the sport workplaces, with many women feeling discriminated against and subjected to unconscious bias. Over half the women surveyed felt ignored and over-scrutinized, having to prove themselves more due to their gender, with 40% believing that their gender had negatively influenced how they were valued in their role. This highlights the impact of systematic gendered practices within sport that favor men and masculine traits and behaviors. This also limits gender equity and the opportunities for women to progress and have real influence. After all, sport has historically been male-dominated pursuit run largely by and for men. Redressing the gender imbalance at the top with quotas has been a catalyst for greater gender diversity, but that is certainly not enough, and certainly not enough for sustainable change. Inclusive cultural change must happen throughout an organization, from grassroots to board level, to ensure both women and men have equal opportunities to thrive. When thinking about leadership in sport, a well-known phrase comes to mind. If we continue to think like we've always thought, we'll continue to get what we've always got. Women's sport has an untapped audience that offers much opportunity for growth, both on and off the field. This was brought to the fore in the summer of 2019 when we saw huge appetite and demand for women's sport. Sport has remarkable ability to inspire and empower women and girls, but to drive real, sustainable change from grassroots to the elite, we need more women leaders from diverse walks of life who can champion women's voices in the leadership structures of sport. In short, we need more ICCs to take policy decisions and more Indra Nuis to be appointed at the top. However, it is not simply good enough to invite women to the table. The culture of sports needs a transformative shift in thinking that truly embraces diversity and inclusion to reap the game-changing benefits that women leaders can bring. Some of the recommendations that I would like to make for inclusion of women, I mean, not necessarily just in leadership positions, but in India, because there's such little opportunity for women to even participate in sport to start with, are one, my first recommendation would be to start a movement to sport, like Anjali, our core speaker here, has through her initiative, Indian Women's Football Alliance. Girls should just be encouraged to play an organized team sport or even an individual sport from a very young age. Secondly, like just basic primary education, sport should also be made compulsory. I mean, I'm not even talking about competitive sport here. What I'm trying to say is that just recreational, healthy sport. More girls should play more games. I mean, ideally, the message that should be spread out is sport for health. Girls should be educated and made aware of the health benefits of sport instead of being told not to play sports for reasons like undergoing their menstrual cycle or for the fear of developing unladylike attributes. I mean, today, 90% of the women in India suffer from polycystic ovaries. And I think if you go to any doctor, the first thing they turn around and say is that, you need to maintain a healthy lifestyle. You need to go work out. So, the myths need to be broken. That's what is most important. Next, we need to conduct a talent search frequently all across India, especially in rural and semi-rural regions. Also, girls should be allowed to make a choice of their game. I mean, no sport should be deemed as a manly sport, so to speak. I still remember when I started playing cricket at about the age of 7 or 8, everyone pulled me down saying it's a man's game. And when I made it to the India under 19 team, and I thought in my head that I would make it to any university under the sports quota. I was told that most universities don't even have a cricket team for women, so there wouldn't be any sports quota for women out there, those who played cricket. Next, what we need to do is we need to encourage and also run special programs so that more and more women become coaches and referees. In fact, it was only very recently in January, all women umpires were used in the Legends Cricket League that took place in Muscat. So, such initiatives where women umpires are chosen to umpire in matches played by men are definitely sending the right message out there. Further, anyways, most girls tend to suggest that they are happy and more comfortable with female coaches. Next, ex-players should be elected and nominated to the federations, just like the Indian Ladies Cricket Association. We've seen the kind of work they have done and the kind of benefit that they have done to women's cricket, and given how much the performance has improved over the years, thanks to the organization. Girls have also unfortunately spoken about the facilities of living and even toilets in the places of tournaments and the lack of security. This is just a very common and serious issue which is faced by women in general in India. And speaking in a sporting context, this specifically impacts performance. So just the tournament organizers should see to this. Special training sessions should be provided to coaches, referees, and association personnel on issues faced by female athletes and female in general. Next, women interested in sport should be given training on various aspects related to sport, like Women in Sport India, and initiated by Vaidehi, is doing by providing mentorship in sports psychology, sports law, career guidance in general. Girls should be made aware of various career choices that they can have related to the field of sport. Last but not the least, role of media is very vital in the development of women in sport. Media should give more courage to women in sport so that people become more aware of the kind of impact women are making in the industry. Like the recent case of Mrs. Neeta Ambani, the First Lady of Indian Sport, who has been instrumental in India's successful bid to host the 2023 IOC session. I'd like to conclude with a quote by Nelson Mandela. Sport has the power to change the world. It has the power to inspire. It has a power to unite people in a way that little else does. It speaks to youth in a language they understand. Sport can create hope where there was once only despair. Therefore, the moment more women are promoted in sport, it will automatically influence generations to come. Thank you. Happy to take questions after, though I don't know if I'll be able to stay for the entire Q&A session as I have another commitment after.
Thanks so much, Aahna. Some tremendous insights and practical recommendations. And thank you for sort of being a pioneer and hopefully a more approachable mentor than the dearth of mentors that you found some 10 years back from an Indian perspective. You sort of helped me by already introducing our next speaker. Last but certainly not the least, Anjali, who's on the board of another national sport federation, also like Sara, involved in football in the All Indian Football Federation, the AIFF. And Anjali was one of the founders of Premier India Football Academy in India, which is a training academy based out of Mehrotra that has developed a lot of talent, including some state and national level footballers, young women who have done some tremendous things in the sport. Anjali's also managed Mehrotra State Under 14 girls football team. She's pioneered a project called Girls Get Going and is actively involved in the women and football space in an Indian context. So last but not the least, Anjali, handing it over to you.
Hi, Sean. Pleasure to be here with such stellar company. And I'm really glad I have Aahna on my board. She's really summarized everything that really needs to be done for women's football and the position of women in football in India. I think I can just start off by saying, I think we are pretty much where Margot was 30 years ago, plain and simple. That's where we are right now. There's no two ways about it. We are 30 years behind. And my journey into women's football started in 2003 when I actually entered the office of the city City Association to book a ground. And the first thing that I was asked is, what are you doing here? You're a woman. Why are you in a football office? This is how my first introduction to football. And I'm very proud to say, 18 years down the line, just day before yesterday, I have been elected as an executive committee member of that very same association, the Mumbai Football Association. I've become the chairperson for the city football. So Mumbai Football Association. I am the chairperson for the women's football in that same organization that asked me what was I doing in that office. Yeah, so I have been involved with a lot of women's teams from very closely by being a manager of the team, by taking these girls for national duty in various different states of the country. And I really voiced my opinion based on the kind of treatment these girls were getting. You know, we've traveled by unreserved compartments in trains, and you don't want to know about how Indian unreserved second-class trains in India are. They are horrific. They're absolutely horrific. But yeah, that's what was provided to us, and we literally had 10 seats reserved for 25 people, and we have done that. We land up at the facility, and we're given one. Literally a go down where mattresses are thrown on the floor, and we are expected to, look after the girls and make them sleep there. We are given substandard food, and the girls are supposed to perform. It is at that point I realized that no, this is nonsense. Change has to come. We cannot continue this way. And at the same time, we were looking at the facilities for the boys. They were a little better. At least the food being provided for the boys was a little better. So quoting no one special, I decided to use two mantras in my life. I don't know really who has said these things, but they really resonated with what I was doing. If you're not a part of the solution, you are the problem, okay? And secondly, be the change you want to see, So there and then I said, no, if I am going to keep quiet about this and not speak up against all this nonsense that's going on in women's football, then it's absolutely pointless continuing in this sport. And that's exactly how my journey began. And I was vocal at a city level, I was vocal at a state level, I was vocal at the national level. And finally, I think they probably said, this woman is talking too much, let's get her on our board. Maybe that will shut her up. Being a part of the board, she might not, keep on speaking against the association as much as she does. But I didn't stop. Of course, I changed my approach. I started saying things in a nicer way so that, it would actually work and would help everybody. Yeah, and I was really happy to join Sara on the All India Football Federation Executive Committee. We are only 2 women over there. And believe me, we still are a minority. And while we are consulted on a few issues, majority of the decisions are male-led. They're completely male-led over there. And Sara is going to bring about a lot of change. I have a lot of faith in her leadership, and I believe she will make sure she comes out with a fantastic roadmap, and she's got me backing 100% in whatever has to be done to make sure we see girls in leadership positions. Now, the reason I think it's important, see, in India, women play sports for a completely different reason than probably why girls play in other parts of the country. I'm not saying that girls in other parts of the world don't play sports for the same reasons as they play in India. But particularly in India, every girl who plays a sport has a point to prove. She wants to change her life. She wants to change her situation. She wants to get out of the situation she is stuck in. And sports is her escape route. Okay, so that's point number 1. The reason why girls play sports is very different. We need to be representatives of these girls who want to change, who want to improve their life. And in a lot of instances, we have to be the voice for these girls who want to survive. there are a lot of women in India who just can't survive because of the circumstances, whatever those are. Let's not get into those. But yeah, we need to be those voices. We need to be their caretakers. We need to be actually gatekeepers to ensure that there is no harassment meted out to these girls. And believe me, there is a lot of harassment of girls in sports. We need to be those gatekeepers and ensure that these girls are treated well, they're treated with respect. You know, they are not manipulated, they are not treated badly. And we should make sure that this sport actually helps them achieve whatever dream it is that they have. Whatever the dream is, someone wants to get a job, someone wants to, earn some money, someone wants to, change their family situation. Yeah, so this is basically what it is. I think it's really important that everyone gets involved in leadership positions and serves as a role model for these girls, so that going further, these girls can become leaders within their own communities and spread the word that women in positions of leadership and decision making can actually change a lot for women's sport in any country. I'll just end it at that, and we'll be happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
Anjali, thank you. Thank you so much. I think we could go on for hours, quite frankly. And I just wanted to pick up on 2 points you raised. The first is, we are where Margot was 30 years ago. I might put it to Margot to comment on that, but I just want to note that having heard from the three of you from India today, I'm certainly hopeful that it won't take 30 years to reach where Australia is now, and certainly the direction we're going in. But I'll put that to Margot, because you've all been quite inspiring. And your other point that I wanted to draw out was, it's important to serve as role models for the girls of today. And I think Sara, yourself and Aahna are doing that in an Indian perspective. And I'm sure our participants and audience members would agree with that. I'll throw it to you, Margot. I know we're out of time. I might just let you comment on Anjali's point there, and then we might sort of wrap up shortly. I feel we can host a whole nother workshop to brainstorm the next steps and how we can work together in this space. So Margot, just to comment.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sean. Thanks, Anjali. That's very sad if you feel that you're back where we were in 1991 or thereabouts. But I think there are a lot of commonalities in what you said about attitudes, biases, and they do take a while to undermine, I suppose, or influence to affect change. I'm not in a position to really judge the character of our different societies particularly well, but I'm thinking that Indian society is very patriarchal. Ours is, but perhaps not to the same extent. And I'm wondering whether change has been more readily affected here, perhaps at a faster rate. But I do think that it's all the things that you all have talked about will make a difference. But ultimately, I think it's having a go. It's, as Juanita said, putting your hand up, having a crack, and trying to get yourself into positions of influence, networking, talking. And as I said before, but the comment from Sara, who wrote me the note to say yes, get an opportunity to say yes. And maybe the pace of change will be faster and you won't have to wait for 30 years that we have to get where we've got to, which is still not a perfect position by any means, but it's a work in progress. Thanks, Sean.
So much, Margot. Juanita, you had a comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think it's really important that we all going forward use language that's inclusive of male and female, and when we're making decisions about things like infrastructure and support staff, it's for all, not just for males and females. So, that's one way to be more inclusive naturally going forward. And I'd just say to any of our listeners or viewers that are looking to get into sports governance, to be absolutely confident in your ability, and any opportunities that that come across your desk, take them.
Thanks, Juanita. Again, I just feel we could talk for hours, couldn't we, on all these things? And I want to thank all of our speakers today. It's certainly been not only inspiring and kind of an illustration of the opportunities and challenges. I'm going to put everyone on screen now so we can acknowledge all of you. But there was so many practical insights today, in my view, from Johanna's empirical insights at an international level and the practical recommendations that many of you made and the journeys that you shared. And I wonder, Johanna, if we can lobby to get the World Conference on Women in Sport in India in one of the next forums to discuss these important issues. Juanita mentioned the Minerva network. I'm not sure that there's an India chapter, but perhaps if there's not, there should be something similar. And that's something that we can lobby for. And we've got champions, 3 champions from India here who could hopefully help get that rolling. And the lunches and events, Margot, that you host in Australia, there's really a gap in India that's begging for these kind of networking opportunities, mentorship opportunities to, as Aahna said, so in 10 years' time or shorter, we've got those champions of change, men and women. I know that for a change, I'm the odd one out on this panel, and it's a real pleasure being able to say that. But I think what Juanita said about your forums, Margot, is very important, that this conversation isn't just between women. From India's perspective, 93% of board members are men. They need to be part of this conversation as well. There's certainly a cultural change that's needed.
I will say about my lunches, they are also, well, they're not all men and women, but the women ones are a really fantastic opportunity for older women and younger women to meet, for people to say, hey, I've talked to you on the phone or we've emailed, how are you in the flesh? And I can't tell you the number of contacts and opportunities that has created, all just out there sort of organically, people talking to people, and that's what really makes the difference. It's those conversations. What do you do? How do you do it? Oh, I didn't know about that. Yeah, can you send me some information? So it's incredibly successful, very easy to do, and I'm happy to talk to anyone in India, any of you who wish to take up the idea. And as the Minerva network, as Juanita said, but lunch is just very easy, and I recommend it.
Sounds like Jindal and our Centre for Sports Law, Business and Governance have a bit of a call to action there to host a couple of these events in the coming year. I again just wanted to thank you all. I'll hand it over to my colleague Divyangana to say a few words and close things out today.
A very engaging and inspiring webinar we've had today. I'm very grateful to our panelists for sharing their views, which has been a very good learning experience for us. I thank Professor Shah for moderating today's event and encouraging me to take the lead on this project that has meant so much to me, which includes, of course, corporate governance, which is my area. And we've got Professor Sean really complementing it with the sports governance perspective. Last but not least, I thank the Government of Australia for supporting our project under the Australian Alumni Grant Scheme. And if there are no further questions, then maybe we can close the webinar now.
Perfect. Thank you, Divyangana, and thank you to all of our speakers and members of the audience. I'm conscious that we are out of time, and both audience members and panelists have other things to go to, but I undertake to do a follow-up session in the not so distant future. There's plenty more to talk about when we have more time to do so. So thank you, everyone, and we'll wrap up formally now. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Lovely to meet you.